So I'm going to be speaking today about Monolith to microservices. This is a journey actually that my teams are currently on, and a subject kind of near and dear to my heart. So again, my name is Jason. I'm at the ADP Innovation Lab. As Amit Maimon was mentioning earlier, we're actually right upstairs in this very building. So super convenient for me to be able to speak here. And Twitter handle there, although I'm not too active on there those days. I'm more of the social stalker. So a little bit of the agenda of the things I want to run through today, a little bit about ADP just to set some context and some of the things that we're doing there, both ADP at large as well as at the Innovation Lab. Talking about our particular little, kind of special monolith that we have and some of the inherent friction that we're seeing both organizationally and technology-wise. Also talking about kind of the organizational investment that we had to make because, the journey into microservices is not simply a technology journey. It's organizational, it's stakeholder buy-in, it's technology, and almost most importantly, it's culture. So then talking a little bit about the strangulation of our monolith and some of the approaches that we're taking therein to be able to arrive at, the microservices nirvana point. Promise theory, talk a little bit about, what does it mean to be a citizen of microservices in a large distributed development effort, one where we have federation across the globe. How can we actually stand up a set of cohesive and composable services in a way that we can trust? Enabling microservices, so some of the technologies, some of the patterns, and some of the adoption that we've gone through, and what does the journey ahead look like for us? Okay. So ADP at scale, just to give you guys a little bit of some of the numbers of some of the things that we're doing purely on the SaaS side of things, where we look at software as a service. ADP is primarily known for payroll, but we're also very focused on the HCM space, which is human capital management. So we have about roughly, these numbers are larger now since these slides were put together, but about 490,000 cloud clients. Roughly about 35 million active users, essentially consumer web scale of what we're doing. About 5 million logins roughly per day, and 19,000 logins per second. And some of the folks at the lab ran the numbers. If you're a professional in the United States, you have roughly about an 89% likelihood of being on an ADP payroll system at some point in your career. So fairly significant. And these numbers sound all well and good, and this is interesting stuff. But really for us, we see this as we see the size and this longevity as something really at a risk, right? Something that's a risk for us and something that's ripe for disruption. So we want to disrupt that, and we want to disrupt ourselves in terms of what ADP is doing. So to give you a little bit of a snapshot of human capital management at ADP, and some of the challenges, kind of painting the picture of the monolith that we've built and the journey that we're on. Many different types of client profiles, right? Whether you have like the largest of organizations with extremely nested hierarchical structures, all the way to the more kind of flat holacratic organizations, to the kind of couple of person shop that needs to organize their workforce. Multiple different client profiles, multiple consumption types, so whether it's desktop, mobile, Internet of Things, different kinds of sensors. Those are really kind of the consumption mediums that we're building for. Frequent spikes in usage, whether it's weekly payroll runs, quarterly numbers that need to be run, everyday usage, like some of the login metrics I just walked you through, tax season, company events, a lot of spikes in usages. And multiple contextual layers for compliance and regulatory matters, whether it's personal information, how we deal with, say, someone's personal information in Germany versus a citizen of the United States. Very different touch points for that data and very different regulations that tell us how we can behave with that data. And it's a stewardship that we take very, very seriously. And all this obviously is globally distributed, needs to be highly available, and always accessible for our end users. So what we started to build was what we like to call kind of the organized monolith. And it was great. It was kind of the way that it really kind of made sense for us at the time to start this way. Because before you understand really kind of the different, whether you say, well, I want to do microservices or I want to do SOA, whatever it may be, it's hard up front to understand kind of how you bound your microservices, how you split things out. So we started building this as a monolith, and we started as a single application. So we have a single large development group with a massive monolithic application now at this point. Teams, kind of quote own features, and we all have to wait for these kind of big bang release cycles to be able to push out any kind of features, whether it's incremental, tiny feature sets that we want to push out to our end users, or more of the kind of major refactoring initiatives or new features that we're spinning up. So it's proving to be a really a big challenge for us. So we needed to take a look at this and really look at, one, how are we doing this, right? Both from an organizational perspective and how we're structured, from a technology perspective, and the different tools and the different resources that we're bringing to bear. And a lot, kind of some more of the bad of where we found ourselves with this monolithic approach, the maintainability and the clear ownership of particular features, particular modules that are built within the system. Just the general cognitive overhead of whether they're architects on the team or just developers on the team, trying to keep the entirety of what we're doing inside of someone's head or a group of people's heads. It's the every day you go, the more likely that you are to miss something, and that entire platform, the monolith, just weighs on you. Build, test, deploy the entire unit just for small changes, as I just mentioned. New developer onboarding is a huge challenge for us. We would spend multiple weeks with a new developer, just getting them kind of to a very shallow depth of acclimation with the platform and with the modules that we've created. And of course, technology and stack limits. We all have to be hand in hand. We all have to, say, for instance, be on the same version of Node.js and the same type of application platform, as well as operating systems, right? Even down to the actual kernel and what we can run on. We need to all be in lockstep there. And scaling is a huge challenge, right? Yeah, you can say, okay, I can take a monolith and I can just scale that out, I can fan that out. But then you're really missing a lot of opportunities around resource utilization, being able to just tune up certain modules, certain aspects of your application. And that was just really bad for us. Amit was mentioning in the panel earlier that we're not up in production for end users today, but we do have what we treat as production, which is our developers that are building applications, line of business applications on top of our platform. And so scaling was already proving to be a challenge in that landscape. So Conways Law, I'll say air quotes around law, is an interesting one for us. I mean, some folks would argue that it's not actually a law in the sense of a physics law, but we like to see it as kind of an observation around what the organization is and is producing. So, organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the structures of these organizations. And this was essentially a place where we found ourselves in, where both the application was kind of one large thing. The teams and the way that we were structured from an organizational perspective was essentially one large thing. We like to think about it as differently, but really that was the case, because even though you have multiple teams, if you don't have clear ownership of those aspects, of those modules, and of those services, you are essentially one big team. And so this was something that we recognized, and we recognized that we needed to make that change. So what we set off to do was we wanted to go ahead and strangle our monolith and go through a process of monolith strangulation. Breaking down the bureaucracy of the architecture and the bureaucracy of the organization itself. So we set out on a task of essentially identifying the business processes and the encapsulation of those processes from down to the low level at a code perspective. And we wanted to identify how can we organize this application to bring a lot more clarity to what we're doing and what we're building, a lot more encapsulation and scope of ownership, as well as being able to define when something happens, who's the owner of that something. And so for us, microservices was a really clear win for us to be able to do that, purely from an organizational perspective, but then obviously with all the technology benefits that we see therein. So we set out to really kind of garner buy-in from the key stakeholders to really support us on this journey, because regardless of any of this, it is a journey. It's not a finish line that someone gets to. It's a path that you set out on, and you have to be willing to kind of alter that path as you go. So that was really key for us. And hopefully being able to arrive at this place of having all of these kind of composed autonomous services that are essentially delivering our platform out to our end users. So yeah, this is great, right? What we can arrive at and what we can now do with carving this up. And a lot of the things that folks throughout the day have been talking about, the loose coupling and the bounded context is super important for us. Zero coordination of frequent and rapid deployments. You want to make sure that you deploy a single service at a single time, but you still want to be able to have kind of a zero coordination and have your tools really help you to do that. Whether it's kind of implementing sequential rollouts, a semaphore, whatever it may be, how can we just push things out rapidly? Going from kind of release cycles that look to be around 2 to 3 weeks down to 2 to 3, if not more, releases every single day. And doing that within an organization such as ADP is a very, it's more of a mind shift than a technology shift than anything else. And so, some of the ways that you can do this is, the concept of these dumb pipes, right? Language agnostic APIs, typically HTTP based or REST, that's kind of where we start from. But then we quickly get into identifying, what are the synchronous services versus the asynchronous services. I think this is a really key thing to be able to call out within your platform, within your applications, is what is the best way to compose services together and be able to chain those, very similar to how you can chain the Linux command line. There's also things like binary exchanges, whether you're looking at Avro and some transports such as that. Separate repositories for each service. I think this is a really important one. You want to, all the way down to the level of how a developer is interacting with their service and with their code. You want them to be segregated into their own repository so that they have their own freedom to, create feature branches, push things forward, and have their scope of being mitigated. Fault isolation and instant application level rollback was really important for us. Some of the challenges that I talked about in terms of the organizational limitations that we were encountering. If we had a problem with the platform, the whole thing was a problem. The whole thing would go down. So how do we identify fault isolation? And how do we institute the ability to institute application rollback instantly? So if we, as Rich from nearForm was talking about, if we push out a service and we see that one of our invariants or one of kind of our KPIs has gone down significantly, we can roll that back immediately. We also have the ability to push out multiple services and kind of do A/B testing between those from a performance perspective. So it's really important to understand the benefits of that and understand how to exercise those constructs in order to be able to have a chance at being successful around microservices and the journey from Monolith there. And a huge one, obviously, is stack freedom. Stack freedom not only speaks to what can you do and building the right tool for the right job, but I think it speaks almost more so to developer engagement, excitement, the ability to onboard someone new and have them really excited to build a new service and a new technology that they're really interested in, and the ability to spin up proof of concepts on new tech that you never would have entertained before because of the refactoring and the investment that you would have had to make to be able to arrive there. This one I can't stress that one enough, and how excited I see the excitement that I see in my teams over that prospect. So, containers or not, services for the most part should be disposable and ephemeral. I think, containers are obviously, the best means to be able to arrive there, but you need to think about your services as such. They will spin up, they'll spin up ad hoc, whatever kind of elasticity concerns that you have. A super important concept to understand is around the ephemerality of things. And to me, folks were talking earlier about what's really the difference between SOA and microservices. And yeah, I think it's kind of the size of things maybe gets a little bit smaller, but a big one for me is the notion of this shared nothing infrastructure, and the ability to say, well, okay, if I'm a service, I own my persistence, I own my concerns, and I can be an island unto myself. That's where I think I see the difference between SOA and microservices, whereas SOA had a lot of kind of shared tenants creeping throughout the architecture. If you start to see within your organization, as you're going, carving up your monolith, you see patterns emerging such as maybe a shared persistence layer or shared state, you may be doing things wrong. And really, it's embrace Murphy's Law. Everything can and will fail, and that needs to just be a mind shift as you look at how you write your services and how you implement things. Okay, a little bit more on the organization and kind of the culture and mind shift that's necessary as we look to embark on services is this notion of promises. And there's a theory in the industry called promise theory, and I'm just going to read this for a second because I think it's super important. A model of voluntary cooperation between individual autonomous actors or agents who publish their intentions to one another in the form of a promise. A promise is a declaration of intent whose purpose is to increase the recipient's certainty about a claim, past, present, or future behavior. So what am I talking about here? I'm talking about service contracts. And I'm talking about standing up service contracts that are essentially promises from one group or one service to another. And adherence to these promises is key. And a really big one and a thing and a spirit and a way that we approach things in the lab is a notion of design by contract. And I can talk about design by contract for hours, but in terms of services, it really comes down to your contract definitions and your SLAs. And a lot of people can see this as something that's quite restrictive. Well, hey, I need to stand up a contract and adhere to that contract and live up to that promise. But I think it's actually a very freeing thing. It allows for full autonomy. It allows for true innovation. Because if you stand up your contract and you live up to your contract in terms of what your consumers are expecting, your backing service is essentially a black box that you can then do whatever you want to inside of there. And you can switch out technology, you can switch out implementations, and your consumers never skip a beat, and they never see a change in that. And then you can even source multiple services that adhere to the same contract, and through the means of different, whether it's recommendation engine patterns or machine learning feedback, you can see which ones are more preferred, which ones are performing better, and you can start to make very kind of empirical decisions about what you do, as opposed to kind of sensing trends in the industry or other kinds of more subjective approaches to implementing services. One of the tools that we use in terms of doing this, which is a super simple, straightforward tool, is Swagger, to be able to stand up contracts, publish those contracts, and have other service consumers being able to write implementations against that. And I think a huge thing that you need to drive within your teams is to have this be as real-time indicative as possible. If your contracts get stale, then they'll be called into question, and your consumers will not be able to rely on you. Therefore, you don't make good promises. Okay. So one of the key ways we started going about this monolith strangulation approach beyond the encapsulation of the code is a notion of lift and shift. So if we look at kind of the monolith before we start, it's this one big blob with all functionality and all modules resident within a single application. A very simple, straightforward way that you can take is just to leverage your monolith and extract everything out of it into its own different constituent services. And your monolith still exists. It's now kind of a carcass, but it's at least serving as a reverse proxy and a means to not change too much of the consumer-facing aspects, but still be able to have service proliferation behind the scenes. So this can be a very kind of powerful first step in terms of how you carve up your microservices. Okay. You then can take your carcass and you can switch that out, put in something like an Nginx reverse proxy, have some means by having the right tool for the right job in terms of how you're doing your orchestration there. And this is kind of a very simplistic way to approach it, but I think it's a very powerful one to kind of think of this as a very kind of iterative type of a thing. Some alternatives can be kind of, like I said, standing up other proxy servers. However, this only gets you so far, right? Very quickly, you want to identify the differences between synchronous and asynchronous services and plan for your architecture accordingly. Also, service sprawl will happen from day one. So the tooling around dynamic service registration and routing, dependency graphs, real-time service topologies, these all become critical. And you need to get pretty mature, pretty robust pretty quickly to be able to handle all these multiple kind of actors within your system and how you reason with managing that, deploying that, and understanding when there is an issue, how to pinpoint that. So I think looking at offerings around some key value registries such as like console.io, etcd, these kind of forms, at least for us, like a great starting point to start understanding how we do that, and then you can mature things out from there. Because very quickly you also want to start implementing, whether it's logging, central logging services, auditing, resource scheduling, health and elasticity. You just start to you grow your services ecosystem to a much more robust state quite quickly. Okay, we started macro, and then we're going to micro, right? So I don't think it's too worthwhile to get into kind of like an academic debate about, okay, what is the quantification of a microservice? It's really about a bounded context of a domain, creating a larger service, and then having the ability within a domain context to have that autonomy to break things down further into microservices. So again, this iterative approach for how we address this. Day one, in our particular example, we saw roughly about 20 larger services emerge. We're quickly going to grow to well above 60 plus and even beyond. So constantly trying to kind of get to that level of microservice quantification. And even someday we'll be at a conference talking about nanoservices. So we'll see, maybe a function per service. One of the big things for us was really thinking about the client. And the client in this case are going to be services which are consuming or dependent on the services that you're standing up. So if we look at just a little bit of JavaScript here, after we've kind of done the job of organizing our code, this might be one implementation that we look at. So we're requiring foo.js, and we want to calculate some object that we pass in, which is bar, and we want the size of this object. Okay, great. This is within a monolithic application. If we were just to stand up a service that would give us the functionality to calculate the object size of a given object, it might look something like this, right? Where you're having to use a lot of kind of the piping and the boilerplate to stand up making an HTTP request call. And this can work, but it's not really being a great kind of citizen of the community and supporting your users and supporting your consumers. So you want to start thinking about it more in terms of this, right? Your clients don't want to deal with that boilerplate. They want to stand up a service quickly, and they want their implementation to be pretty much one-to-one with what they had before. Again, this is kind of in the context of that monolith strangulation. As you move on and you mature things, you move on to V2, V3 of your services, that may impact the implementation more fundamentally. But at least up front, you can do things like standing up a client library for your service that gives folks the same functional API to consume your service that you started with in the first place. So this was a very, very powerful concept for us to be able to kind of just switch in implementation and have it be little to zero impact on the consumers of that service. So how do you do this? You need to test and deliver. Establish a comprehensive test harness to provide a safety net as you strangle your monolith. Unit testing alone provides an incomplete picture of service correctness. Multiple services, data stores, and external components require integration tests, contract testing, failure injection testing, and end-to-end testing strategies. So test is key. So I would say the two takeaways here are promises and tests, and that's how you can get it done. You want to extract one bounded service at a time, test the correctness, and then move on to others. Okay, and ideally you can attack the high dependency areas first, kind of do the hard things up front. That's proved pretty successful for us to embark on things that way. And benchmarks and metrics are key. If you don't understand your benchmarks and your metrics up front, you have no idea what direction you're heading in. Am I improving service availability and responsiveness, or does it just kind of feel right? And you want to be able to empirically point a finger right towards that. Health endpoints, consistent health endpoints amongst all the services that are at play in your ecosystem, I think is another key factor to be able to understand both the health of a particular service as well as all of the backing dependencies for that service. Okay. So how do we enable microservices? What are some of the technology and the ways that we can actually do this? And this is just our, in our particular journey, how we do this is through containerization, infrastructure as code, infrastructure as a service, and platform as a service, and kind of really adopting all of those things pretty much in one fell swoop for how we can embark in this new world. And so the deployment pipeline looks a lot different when you start to do those things. You have your teams which are working on their particular microservices. They're building out to an infrastructure as code provider, something like Jenkins, and that's creating an immutable container, an immutable image that can then be pushed up to any environment that you want. Maybe that's local consumption for other people, other teams that need to consume your service, or the same exact image all the way up to production. DevOps culture doesn't come for free. So this is, again, that cultural shift, that mind shift that you need to take. Feature teams and ops teams are one and the same. You build it, you ship it, you support it. I think Diptanu from Netflix covered this point really well this morning about PagerDuty and about all of his devs are on PagerDuty supporting the services that they put up. But that doesn't mean that you cut ops out of the picture. It just means that you partner with ops much more closely. You bring them into the fold, you make it one team. And especially at a large organization and the organization at the scale of ADP, that's how we can be successful in doing that, because there's rich talent in there, and you want to be able to leverage that. So you essentially want that divide between ops and dev to be imperceptible, okay? And let's see, this one is a bad slide for here because it's tough to read, but just a little bit of the deployment pipeline and how we can register services as that goes out. I know I'm getting low on time, so let me just skip ahead here. Some of the kind of infrastructure that we look at and that we're particularly using right now. So from a locals perspective, we're using Vagrant. Vagrant gives us a consistent substrate, a consistent VM, whether folks are on Windows, Mac, doesn't matter. Portable, so Nginx and Console to give us service routing and discovery. Docker is a container platform to be able to ship our microservices into. And then that portable layer goes through our infrastructure as code piece managed by Jenkins out onto our infrastructure as a service, a combination of some Amazon, Google, and hopefully OpenStack when we look at on-prem type of solutions, and platform as a service layers. So things like Docker Swarm, Mesos, Kubernetes. These are ways that you can get that kind of that optimal resource allocation as well as the kind of elasticity and scalability necessary for services adoption. So for us, really, the journey is the reward. We're looking now as in kind of our next evolution of things around, again, elasticity, self-healing services, some back pressure concepts, allowing composed actors to react in systematic ways and responding to performance peaks and valleys, essentially QoS recommendations, right? How can we recommend if we source two different services in an A/B fashion, which one should win? Which one is the best one to get this particular payload or this particular job? It might be a critical time for a particular client, or it just might be a performance benchmark that we're trying to hit. Failure injection, I think failure injection is key. Some facets around like the Simian Army and some of the things that Netflix are doing there. Really interesting stuff to look at in terms of how you want to deal with both your hosts as well as your data center and just causing chaos within. And you want to promote kind of service competition. You want to field multiple horses into the race and see which one wins. And that's a key driver for us in terms of microservice adoption. So I had to kind of rush through a little bit at the end there, but I want to just thank everyone. And again, I want to mention, you know, kind of the ADP Innovation Lab and some of the things that we're doing here. I know that we have a couple of our recruiters in the audience today. I think they can raise their hand if they're here. Tony and back there. So if anyone's interested in finding out more and joining us, we'd love to talk with you. So thank you.